So today, we ask the question, should you play the greatest JRPG of all time? So starting off, we're gonna go right into Act 1 of this review, and that's gonna be introductions. JRPGs as they were versus where they are today. So today's question is one of those fun, controversial discussions. Today, we're going back in time. We're looking to the 90s. The decade I was born in. A time of pagers, baggy suits, cult classic movies due to the VHS, and of course, gaming consoles. In today's world, the PC may be reigning supreme, but in the 90s, everyone wanted a console. Anyone who wanted to play games that weren't point-and-click adventures wanted a controller in their hands and wasn't looking to pay 25 cents per attempt. And one console that spoke to every child, and of course adults at the time, was the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, also known as the SNES. The SNES was a 16-bit machine, a literal double up from the NES. It was released in 1990 within Japan and South Korea, and it made its way to the American shores by 1991. A few years before I even found myself on those American shores. For a whopping $199 US, which is $445.26 per the 2023 cost comparison rates chart I found on Google. The American people became one of the owners to the 23.25 million copies of the SNES, and thus the world of 16-bit gaming began its takeover from the 8-bit world. Most people who grew up, at least in my neck of the woods, knew someone with the SNES, but we all, may that be dependent on financial situations, friend group discourse, gaming magazines, or just what was available at Blockbuster, found ourselves trying different games and different genres. In some psychological discussion, one could probably ascertain that these pivotal childhood moments are what could have shaped you into the gamer that you are today and how it influences the media that you consume presently. And today's game was one of those games that took hold into the minds of children and adults alike. And that game is Chrono Trigger. So let's ask our question. Should you play the greatest JRPG of our time, Chrono Trigger? I think to really dig into that question, we need to delve into the roots of what makes a Japanese role-playing game. A Japanese role-playing game, in general, can be seen dating all the way back to 1982, known as Koei's Underground Exploration. But as you Google that name, you'll see that it doesn't really fit what we call a JRPG by today's standards, or even what we called them within the 1990s. A JRPG, traditionally, and I use that word traditionally lightly, as the point of media is to push the boundaries of what you have if it allows you to tell your story or message, has a simple set of standards. So the JRPG is made in Japan, or in today's modern world is influenced by Japanese culture. It has linear storytelling, it will contain character development, and the combat systems are with predefined protagonists, turn-based battles, and colorful graphics. And those 4 points haven't really changed at all. There's always a weird debate when it comes to the question of what was the first in any media genre. But looking to this genre's definers, you'll see Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy being the most familiar and popular iterations to give these 4 bullet points. And if those names sound familiar to you, it really shows that from the first iterations in Japan dating back to as early as 1986 on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Casual 38 years have happened since then, and we're still making games under those brands and names. It's kind of wild to think. But looking at Chrono Trigger, we see a few interesting pieces as it compares to the heavy hitters of its time, especially when it comes to the Super Nintendo. Many fans and reviewers that write much better than I call this game a masterpiece. And personally, I think it's because Chrono Trigger has 2 categories of development that it excelled at. The first category itself is excelling in combination. Chrono Trigger to me is a game from a different era of gaming. Even looking back at 1995, there aren't even that many console JRPGs that are available to consumers, especially on the United States side. But this game comes along with great music, a great storyline, great characters, a great and different battle system than traditional turn-based, great pacing, great difficulty and challenges, and great replayability. There's a reason I've reused the word great as the adjective here, because to me, none of these parts are truly that outstanding, but it's the combination of all these parts that make it into a masterpiece. As I perused articles and forum discussions, people have had this conversation many times before I even investigated the game. But many are going to reverberate this same statement. If one of these parts wasn't great and was terrible, for example, if the music wasn't as iconic and memorable as it was, the game wouldn't be considered a masterpiece. Which makes me think of one of my favorite quotes from Lord of the Rings of all things. Galadriel, who's this elf queen, says to the Fellowship, "The quest stands upon the edge of a knife. Stray but a little, and it will fail, to the ruin of all." Something I think about often when I look at any media that's considered a masterpiece. It is that perfect balance that captures the hearts of so many. The other important category that Chrono Trigger had was a passionate and dedicated team. And they were some of the best. This team was stacked, as someone cooler than me would say. The team included, and forgive my pronunciations, but Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of Final Fantasy, Yuji Horii, the creator of Dragon Quest, and Yasunori Mitsuda and Nobu Uematsu, composing the soundtrack. And then there was Akira Toriyama, the creator of Dragon Ball. And quick statement and aside is that I did want to say rest in peace to Akira Toriyama. As I was playing through Chrono Trigger, I heard of his passing and wanted to take the time to say how wonderful of a creator he was, and how one of the things that drew me to Chrono Trigger to add to my Should You Play series was the art of the game's cover. His unique style and touch are something I don't think we'll ever see properly recreated. So going back to the team, we're seeing a video game version of a musical supergroup coming together to work on an agreed project. From the progenitors of JRPGs to combining fantasy storytelling, aesthetic design, and music to wrap everything together, people were introduced to a loved story and game filled with talent. Breaking down a few of these elements, we use both combat and linear storytelling coming forward from the Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest elements. The game does include, well, at the time, a progressive use of time within the turn-based combat, which allowed character speed to influence when they acted within these combat turns, instead of the standard, I go first because I'm faster approach. Something we would still see from Pokemon, even to today, with games such as Octopath Traveler. Even as I write this, one of the closer versions, although arguably way more advanced, of this combat system wasn't something I even saw until modern games like Final Fantasy XIII or even Final Fantasy VII's remake. But I will say that's like a 20+ year drawn comparison, and I'm being a bit dramatic. Also, I do have a limited JRPG experience. I've played some of the big hits, but I'm by no means an expert, so if there are other games that implemented these types of styles, let us know, because I am not the expert in that. Turning to Akira's influence, it's a wonderful case of great art and familiarity that can drive a project forward. Dragon Ball, as a series, was something already established, and its unique art style would, and still is, recognizable. A simple glance at both the cover's art and in-game art, you know who was behind the paintbrush, or I guess sketch pen in this case. Finally, there's the music. Music has come up a lot recently in the video game media that I'm passively consuming. And I even need to admit that I enjoy a lot of music theory discussions where there's some amazing dissertations by other YouTubers who dive into a lot of video game music. Some even focusing on Mr. Uematsu's. Shout out to 8-Bit Music Theory, who to me has some of the best dissertations on these topics. I'll drop a link to their channel in the below area thing. Go check them out. My point that I wanted to bring to the music is that music from film to video games is what ties all the other factors together, and that includes the use of silence. Chrono Trigger comes from a video game development time period of what I would call experimental and genre-opposing styles, something we're currently seeing in most modern developments. Chrono Trigger's album composition is made up of atmospheric ambience, catchy signature melodies, and by far one of the most memorable, if not off-putting, battle songs. I mean, seriously, anyone that's played Chrono Trigger knows the battle music's baseline. This combination of musical fidelity keeps the game both thematic and also engaging. Every zone and event that has music is something the player experiences in tandem as the story beats hit them. In comparison, Many games over the past few years have kind of fallen victim to trends, and these can be simply examples such as this is fantasy, so we need violins and a chorus of angelic voices, or hey, we're in a cave, play something ambient. It's thematic, and it fits, but it's meeting your expectations instead of challenging them. However, I'll admit this whole paragraph is just a dramatic statement that I'm trying to say is that I think the music of Chrono Trigger is amazing, and it surprised me throughout the entire game. But now we gotta go into the next act, and we're kind of going into the question of, well, how does this game hold up? Act 2, Nostalgia versus Life as an Adult. So this brings us neatly into Act 2, where we're going to discuss the nostalgic pieces, and also being an adult playing this game. As stated in my introduction, I didn't play Chrono Trigger when it was first released, or even during the Super Nintendo's timeline. I knew of the game, but my friend's circle and my older brother weren't JRPG fans, so I didn't really get to play JRPGs. At least in our youth, the most we had was Pokemon, and maybe some other people got involved with JRPGs. I remember some friends, I call them fringe friends, were very, very into Final Fantasy VII. However, as I got older and I met more people who shared this hobby with me, I was always told that Chrono Trigger is this big deal, and I owe it to myself to play it. Some even told me that, I enjoy time travel stories and sci-fi, so that would totally play a factor into my enjoyment. So now we factor in a life filled with stuff like Stargate Atlantis, Doctor Who, movies like Primer. I'll toss in World of Warcraft, right? They had the Bronze Dragonflight messing with time, and hell, even the Marvel movies went down the time travel, multiverse stuff. So all this stuff combined, and I finally have arrived at playing Chrono Trigger. But even with 30 plus years of its existence, I've never had anything from Chrono Trigger spoiled for me. I haven't seen a cutscene, I don't know the premise. All I know is time travel is involved, and the main character has cool Dragon Ball inspired spiky hair. So with fresh eyes and a love for classics, I dove into Chrono Trigger, based on the Super Nintendo version, and I went to playing. Without any nostalgia enhancing or coloring my decision, I have to say, Chrono Trigger still holds up as just a solid game. Everything I've referenced and alluded to in Act 1 of this video really does stand true. Story, gameplay, music, even the world building as a whole are solid, through and through. I can see where games, since Chrono Trigger have pulled from, like the later Final Fantasy iterations. But I've also seen how Chrono Trigger isn't entirely groundbreaking versus the JRPGs of its time. But as a whole, the best description for just the game is it's polished. However, I do and will say, playing a game like Chrono Trigger in the modern world, being 2024 as my reference point, does have its drawbacks. And really, I think it's just me becoming an old man, or older man, I should say. Chrono Trigger is built for the Super Nintendo, and that comes with the two main factors that I wasn't really prepared for. Respecting your time, and difficulty. And difficulty in the terms of knowing what to do. I wanted to understand Chrono Trigger at its core and at its inception. So, although I own the game on Steam to support the developers, I did also play the game through the Super Nintendo. Now, the Super Nintendo version of the game lacks certain enhancements that modern tech allows, something like autosaves. Chrono Trigger comes from an era of gaming where the only choice to save was to reach a certain save point, and then activate the save. So as a person in their 30s, my gaming time ranges from 30 minutes to maybe a 2-hour interval. Sometimes I wasn't finding myself getting to a save point, which means either losing your progress, leaving the game running, or if you're an emulator person, wink, you can utilize a save state. Seeing that the modern ports solve this problem, I can't really say Chrono Trigger doesn't respect your time, but I do want to go over that more in Act 3. The other point I wanted to highlight is Chrono Trigger is, at least for a JRPG, pretty hard. As I played through Chrono Trigger, I found myself getting lost or stuck on what to do next. There were even several fights where I found my part just being defeated because of a counter or an ineffective move towards my opponent. I didn't find this frustrating, but I did find it interesting. As I continued the game, I started to understand how this JRPG was able to wrap up so many gamers into its just web of addiction in that 90s era. Chrono Trigger does not tell you everything. It does give you just enough to keep you sort of moving forward, and I would say that around the game's 60% mark, at least storyline-wise, you open up the world by opening up direct flight to any area in any time period. It's also at this point in the story that the game no longer has a direct path to the end. In reality, you now have 5 or 6 forks in the road, all leading and coalescing at this end, the big baddie. And sometimes this means talking to a random NPC or referring back to seemingly simple old man at the end of time to point you in another general direction for another quest. And I have to admit, this was frustrating for me. I didn't want to utilize any form of guides or walkthroughs, but with the limited time and life priorities, I did start to feel like I didn't have enough time to just go figure things out on my own, and I even debated putting the game down and scrapping the script and video. But I took a break, and I knew I wanted to see what happened. So I swallowed my ego, and I looked for some help online. And it felt nice, to say the least. I felt like I was consulting my friends at the cafeteria lunch table, or finding out the answer was in this issue of Nintendo Power. It reminded me of a nostalgic feeling that I haven't had in a long time. I didn't know that there were secret items to be had, or side quests from my companions that would bolster them, or even just show me something about them that I would have missed. And that felt awesome. It reinvigorated me to know that there was so much more. Not just the last boss to be killed. So I continued my playthrough. It's interesting to me how old games really did not respect your time or even your mental prowess. I love puzzle games and understanding twists and stories, but Chrono Trigger, it had my number, one could say. I never knew where I was going and what was going to happen next or how all of this would resolve. And it reminded me of those nostalgic times, even though I didn't have a direct connection to this game when it was released. So that kind of brings us to the next important topic in Act, which is the story versus the gameplay. Act 3. Story, story, story. Does gameplay matter, or does it enhance it? Chrono Trigger's story is awesome. The time travel, tastefully done. I describe it as fantasy meets light sci-fi. Things are explained, but not as much as a hardcore sci-fi fan would want. I'd say the characters are deep enough for a 16-bit era game. The visuals, color choices, and music all blend together that make you enjoy watching the story unfold. And the combat effects and visuals are fun too. Which doesn't sound like high praise, but for a JRPG, there's always that temptation to turn off visual effects so that you just grind enemies for experience points. But Chrono Trigger was just too much fun to skip anything. Lightning 2, the spell, may be my most gassed spell, not just for wiping out groups of enemies, but damn, I loved hearing it go off. So, I will say Chrono Trigger is a grand story, and as I mentioned in Act 2, I feel like it doesn't respect your time as a player. It wants to tell its story, and it entices you by including multiple endings based on what you do, when you do it, and who you've helped along the way, which adds to both of its nostalgia and its replayability for years to come. So there's a lot of value for the cost of one game, especially a game being released in the 90s. So I do think this is where my personal issue always has been with JRPGs versus something like Western RPGs, is that Chrono Trigger does need a grind. And although that is common in all JRPGs, even to this day, it presents you story moments and what I would call time severity to the quest. The world's ending. That's not a spoiler. We know where the bad guy is, but we have a time machine, so we can take our time buying beef jerky for people across a 1,000-year span so you can get a cool new item. And I'm not exaggerating on that being a quest line. That took me ages to figure out and a little bit of help from a guide. So we've seen this be common in games from the 90s and the early 2000s versus the games of today. Today's market is much more streamlined. If you reach the final boss, you can beat them. I mean, I wouldn't have a should you play if I don't mention Soulsborne series, but even in moments you're supposed to die in those types of games, you can still technically win. Chrono Trigger actually embodies that, which was kind of mind-shattering to me, to be this little realization as I played. but you can just go and end the game because the option has been presented to you. And if you're in New Game Plus or you've been grinding combat for hours, there's a chance you succeed and you would have gained a special ending that would feel entirely unique to you if this was the 90s. Something to share with your friends at school the next day where most probably wouldn't even believe you. But in that same praise, I found it discouraging. To me, a JRPG with a good story's biggest weakness is that JRPGs want you to grind. From Pokemon, Octopath Traveler, and yes, even Chrono Trigger, you will need to grind to beat the game without frustration and some luck. I do need to admit that this is what I personally believe to be the catch-22 of JRPGs. And although that may be a huge draw for others, it is not something I am always looking forward to myself. And with the combat being what it is, especially in the 1990s on the Super Nintendo, there were moments where I did feel that grind. Click, wait, walk, click, experience, level up, change gear, change party member, click, wait. Rinse and repeat to prepare for the last fight. Something that I've seen change a lot with modern JRPGs. I mean, have you played the Final Fantasy VII Remake? I feel like I've referenced it like 10 times already. It doesn't feel like I'm waiting my turn to attack. But at the same time, Chrono Trigger's battle system and use of speed and time feels the same. Maybe if I was there at its first release, I would never have had this commentary. But alas, with all these comments now made, we can kind of finally wrap up, which is Act 4, Conclusion. Looking back and looking at today, is it worth it? Chrono Trigger is a loved game. And even without any nostalgia tied to it, I wholeheartedly agree that Chrono Trigger is a game worth playing. But it is a longer game, guaranteeing at least 20 to 25 plus hours in your first playthrough, and that's with a little bit of help from the internet to guide you at the end. But who's it for? I'd say Chrono Trigger is for the following. Anyone who loves a JRPG. From combat to storytelling to music to art style. If you ever claim to be a JRPG fan, you're going to respect, if not love, Chrono Trigger. Fans of grand hero stories, you follow Chrono. Hell, you embody him if you're the type of person to rename people in games. Chrono Trigger is a hero's journey, and it's a fun one. I'd never claim this game is confusing to follow, as everything that needs to be explained gets explained. Anyone who enjoys old school games, especially from the 16-bit era, Chrono Trigger is a gold-plated version of the game that existed on the Super Nintendo era. Simple as that. People who enjoy side quests, exploration, and not having your hand held. If you want a game where you may need to reach for a guide or keep a notepad with you to jot down what's weak to what, or what a random NPC mentioned, you're going to love Chrono Trigger. There's no text wasted in this game. But then, who is Chrono Trigger not for? And I'd say it's not for the following. People who don't like longer games. If you're someone who can't invest hours into a game for either the story or to get the action going, I don't think Chrono Trigger is the game for you. Even combat-wise, the game takes a few hours to gain the multitude of a party member. The other person I'd say it's not for is non-story driven people. I mean, I personally love video games for their story, but I understand that to some people, the gameplay is all that matters. Chrono Trigger does have some fun battle systems and build paths for your party members and a lot of the items to be obtained, but I wouldn't say that's the driving point of the game's enjoyment. Chrono Trigger to me is a full package of story, gameplay, art, and music. If you want a hard JRPG with dynamic gameplay and wild battle systems, I bet someone else could probably point you to a much better suited game. And that's really it. I was really impressed with Chrono Trigger, and I'm personally just happy that I played it, even when I did. There's really no time like the present, and I don't feel like I missed out on anything. So if you do intend on playing Chrono Trigger, I would recommend getting the game on something like Steam so that you can benefit the quality of life improvements in modern ports. Of course, I do want to say that all of these are my opinions, and we all have different experiences and viewpoints on the media that we experience, so I'm always curious to hear yours. And with that, thank you for watching.